Next up, we have Fustina Donaghy. I had the pleasure of being on stage with Fustina last year at the Women in Tech panel, and we're really excited to hear this talk, AWS versus GCP. So over to you, Fustina. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. Oh, that's big. Okay, I'm going to stay over here and look at this instead because that's very large. My name is Fustina Donaghy. I'm a VP of Engineering here for a small startup tech company here called Ocular Technologies. And I'm going to talk to you today about AWS versus GCP, step functions versus workflows. I've been working in technology for quite a long time, across multiple different industries, everything from, I think, healthcare, VoIP, financial services, oil and gas, and now most recently, I guess, it's retail. So I've worked in tiny startups, I've worked in like large enterprises, I've worked in small companies, both here and in the US. So I've been around a bit and done quite a few bits and pieces over time. I guess the one thing that's probably core and the one thing that's been the same across all of it, or consistent across all of it, would be my love for data and building data platforms and using software engineering and applying it to data. So I think of data engineers as being software engineers with data on top of that as well. So from a cloud perspective, AWS was probably where I guess I got my grounding. And then now with the environment that I'm in, we have moved on to and we're using GCP. Because within the retail organization or within the retail industry, there's some, I guess, retailers are a bit reticent about being on AWS because they see AWS as Amazon and Amazon being competitors for what they're trying to do. So that's why it's one of the reasons why we looked at GCP. Alrighty. So the story today I'm going to tell you is basically what is AWS and GCP, and there's been lots of people who have given you different flavors of it. I'm going to do a little bit of that and maybe go in a slightly different direction, which is the next bullet point, which is what is serverless. Because I know there's been talk about VMs and about setting up infrastructure as code and things like that. I'm sort of the opposite end, and I'm trying to avoid all of that and just be the icing on top of the cake. Next thing is basically what is workflows and why use them, which is sort of the main reason for my talk. Then I'm going to compare GCP workflows with AWS step functions. Step functions I've used a lot in the past, and GCP workflows is something that we've just been using in the last year. I thought it's just different words, it's all the same thing, but I found out it's sort of not. But so that's it. Then I have a demo, and depending on how far I get, I may or may not do the demo if I run out of time. And then just some final thoughts to wrap up at the end. Okay? Alrighty. So what is AWS? I can't say that, it's too high. What is AWS and GCP? So basically public cloud providers providing scalable services. They provide, they set their stuff up so that we don't have to worry about an awful lot of the things that they look after. AWS has got 200 plus. The plus might be a big plus because that keeps sort of changing and constantly adding things. Services that they have running in the background. GCP has 97 as of me counting last night. So, but there's probably other things that I missed in there. There's other cloud providers. There's Azure, which has been talked a lot about today with Microsoft. Alibaba got a mention as well. Oracle have their own cloud. IBM have their own cloud. There's like DigitalOcean, which is a variation of a layer of a cloud. There's so many out there that it's just deciding which one is the right one for you. All right, so the diagram on the right is courtesy of a diagram from IBM because it was easy and it got everything I needed on it. So basically what this is this looking at the different sort of layers within the cloud. So you have on the left-hand side, sorry, on the vertical, or sort of down the left-hand side, yeah, right first time. You have, starting at the bottom, you've got all the different layers from a technology and building that stack. So you've got your networking, like your cables, you've got your storage where you're putting the stuff, servers, the thing that everybody talks about, serverless, they're still there. You've got virtualization, like the layer you put on top of that, the operating system, then you've got the middleware and all like, your networking and TCP/IP protocols and various things like that. You've got your runtimes, which is your languages. There's a lot. Then you've got your data and your storage, which is everybody needs, loves, talks about, but it can be very problematic. And then you've got your application layer on top of that. As you can see, as you move from left to right, the color on the boxes changes. So it's very green on the left-hand side, at least I think that's green, which is basically if you have it on-prem, you have your own private cloud, you're in control of the world, but you also have all the problems of the world as well because you're in control of everything. And then as you move right, there's been a bit of discussion around infrastructure as a service, which is basically setting up your infrastructure and getting that all out there, using your VMs, doing things like that. Then you've got your platform as a service, which is basically that layer sort of on top of that where you're using that facilities. You don't worry about the server, you're sitting on top of that layer, but you're still sort of setting up your own storage, setting up some of those kind of things. Then you've got serverless, which is the area that I'm going to focus a little bit more on, which is basically where you can use all those different kind of services. You just put your own applications on top of that. So you're using all those core services in order to build your application. So it's like little Lego pieces that you put together to get where you need to be. And then you've got software as a service, which is actually the products that we're building, our SaaS products. So we're giving those to other people where you go onto your browser, you fill in some information, and boom, you're using whatever product that's out there. Whether it's something like Auth0 or whether it's something like, I don't know, the latest like video software online or whatever it is. So it's all sort of there for you. There we go. So serverless. Sorry if I'm preaching to the choir and you're all fully aware, but serverless to me is amazing. I love serverless, and I know there was a Serverless Days conference a few days ago, so I'm not in the wrong place. It's all okay. But to me, serverless computing basically is the cloud model that really appeals to me. It's basically where you allow your developers, so they can deploy code using CI/CD patterns and lots of really good DevOps stuff to get their code out there, but they don't have to worry about the infrastructure. You don't have to worry about, have you patched something? Yeah. Or have you got the most recent version of the software? Have you got enough capacity to store your data and things like that? So the term implies that there's no servers, but as I said a little while ago, there are servers. It just means you don't have to worry about them. There we go. So the benefits of serverless, you can deliver business value faster. I think that's the core. So you don't have to worry about all those other layers. You can basically go in and you can focus on what's the business problem I'm trying to solve and how can I solve it as best I can, using all the tools and all the services that are provided for you. You've got that elastic auto scaling up and down. So if you have workloads that are a little bit spiky, so sometimes you've got really heavy workloads, sometimes there's not that much traffic on it. If you think of something like Super Bowl, where Rihanna's halftime show, people were off doing all sorts of things. Well, actually, they probably weren't. They're probably watching the halftime show this year. But it's like when people are moving around, it's like for the Super Bowl time, there's huge spikes and things that are going on and huge amount of traffic that's required for that. But the day after, not so much. So if you have bulked up your servers because people are all going onto your site because your ads have come on or something like that in the break, you want to have all that capacity. So when people are clicking around and buying whatever your product is, you can handle that sort of traffic. But the next day, you don't need that. So you don't want to be paying for that size of capacity all the year round type thing. So this basically allows you to scale up and down. And then again, you've got that pay for only the services that you use when you use them. And they all scale down to zero, which means they effectively are sitting there. As soon as you need them, they're up again. But when you don't need them, you don't pay anything for them. Because they're not yours. You just use them when you need them. And it works really well for spiky loads, as I just said. And then high availability, which is built in to an extent for most of it. You still need to think about the things that, that Lara has talked about and lots of other people have talked about around security and making sure you understand what's going on. But at the same time, you don't have to be intimately involved in making sure it's happening at all levels. You don't have to worry about high availability and making sure you've got servers and big clusters spun up and everything else, because that's what AWS is dealing with. That's what GCP are looking after for you. And if they've gone down, well, then there's an awful lot of people who have a lot more problems. Okay, so next thing, we're actually getting on to the crux of the matter, which is what is a workflow and why do you bother using them? So basically, it's a set of tasks or a process that needs to happen in a specific order or in a specific way in order to get your job done, or whatever that is. So we use them to connect independent components together in the order that we need them to without having to tightly couple them together. Excuse me. So one task doesn't need to know about the other task, and the whole operation can come to a conclusion. Okay, and this is where the table starts. I'm afraid there's a lot of these coming up. So when we look at GCP workflows and we look at AWS step functions, on the surface, they seem quite similar. And to be honest, as we're going through this, you'll actually see that there are an awful lot of similarities between them. But there's also a few subtle differences that we found out as we've been using them. So basically, step functions, serverless orchestration. So you don't have to provision anything. Oops, sorry. You don't have to provision anything. You don't have to, go out looking. You can basically just build it together. You can put your different components together in the order that you need them to happen in, and you can spin it up that way. It allows you to integrate with all the AWS services and APIs to build your pipelines. So basically, it's saying that when task 1 finishes, then task 2 needs to start, and task 2 shouldn't start before task 1 finishes. There's lots of different options. You've got parallel options. You've got conditional things that you can do. You've got pass-throughs. There's lots of different states and different flows that you can do with that. But it's basically making sure that they're all happening in the right order. And when the workflow or the step function isn't running, you're not paying for anything. Google workflows, very similar. It's basically, but it's combining Google Cloud Services and APIs. And they also talk to all sort of external APIs also. Now, step functions have started to do that because they've now got connected in through their API gateway. But before that, it was very much centered in AWS land. So basically, it's building out reliable applications, process automation, and getting things like that working. And also, Google have indexed on the data science and machine learning pipelines. AWS talk about that as well, but Google specifically call that out. Okay. So types of step functions and GCP workflows. Within AWS step functions, there's 2 types. There was always the standard type, which was the original one that was out there until a few years ago. And we were actually part of that conversation with AWS in getting express workflows taken into account. Because the standard workflow, long-running process, this process can run for a year. That's how long it will actually remember the state, and it will keep things going. You can actually have one process that runs for a whole year by the time it finishes, or one workflow, sorry. It executes exactly once, so it will only happen once, and every action inside and every step inside that workflow will happen only once. It keeps the execution history for up to 90 days after it finishes the whole workflow. So you think a year and 90 days later, you still have all the logs of anything that has been happening over that period of time. It's got 2,000 executions per second, so that's how many that it can spin up concurrently at a time. And it's got 4,000 transactions per second that it can process, which sounds like a reasonable amount. But the load that we were trying to do at the time, you were talking like 29, 30 million transactions you were trying to get through in an hour. So that sort of didn't sort of add up. But so they actually come out then with another type of step function, which is called express step functions. And they're almost like the antithesis of the standard. The way they work is they've got really short durations. So rather than having in that year, it's 5 minutes. I know there's like a massive difference between the two of those, but it means that it can still happen. You can still get that orchestration that you need, especially for things like if you're trying to do like streaming data and things like that, it's coming at you thick and fast, but you still need stuff to happen in a specific order. So it really, really works well for that. So also then you can do executions that are synchronous or asynchronous, depending on which they are. Depends on whether or not you can have at most one or whether you can have only one. Also then the execution history, you're lucky if you've still got it in 5 minutes because they're going through so fast. And then if you look to see the executions per second, you can see it's radically jumped. So you've got 100,000 per second now instead of 2,000. And then for the executions per second, and then the transactions are basically unlimited. So there's like a huge difference in them in doing that. So depending on what your workload is, depends on which one you would choose, because they've got very different pricing models as well, which I will show you in a little bit. Google Workflows, it's very straightforward. There is only one type, and the way they work, it's very straightforward. So again, they have this long-running concept of a year. So you could start something, you could have some big data process that happens in the middle of, that goes off, that waits for, a person to do a response that then goes off and does something different. And it can take, obviously it can take a year to get from one end to the other. and it manages and keeps track of what's going on that whole way through. They've got a maximum number of workflows per project. So depending on how you've organized, I don't know, like how many people here are on Google, like GCP platform? You? AWS? You're on all of them? All right, Azure, is that the biggest number here? You've got them too? Okay, cool. This person's got all of them. Multi-cloud over here. Yeah, so basically it's, oh, I'm so sorry, microphone, apologies. So the maximum number, depending on how you've organized your projects, if you've got one project per environment, or if you've got a project for every function you're spinning up or things like that, that 10,000 can be impactful. If you have one environment per project and then you've got everything deployed inside that, that could obviously affect what you're able to do with these workflows. Again, it's got the same thing. It's got a 90-day execution history, so you can keep that, you can get that information for a long time. And then you've got maximum of 2,000 concurrent executions. So GCP also just recently brought in parallel options, so you can run things in parallel. So as you can imagine, if you're trying to do a big fan out, that 2,000, you can hit that quite easily. Again, there's only one type of workflow in Google, but they do have other services that do, like they've got Composer, which is basically the same as Apache Airflow, but you pay for their managed services. They manage the environment. You just pay for the services on top of that. And they also have data flow. They've got a few different things that you could use. Data proc, I think, is another one. Alrighty. So the next one is features. So AWS Step Functions. So they have direct integration with those 200 to 220 is in their literature, but they say 200 plus in other places. So we'll go with the 220 here. AWS services and over 10,000 APIs. And again, that's because they've just introduced the API gateway as something that they can interact with relatively recently. So that has hugely changed that. They've got pay per use. So again, it's serverless, so it comes up and down as and when you need it. And that's the same for the Google workflows as well. It's pay per use as well. So it's all serverless for both of these. On AWS, they've got high availability and fault tolerance. So has Google. So they're very similar. And then on AWS, they have that visual operator dashboard for monitoring and troubleshooting. Google has a dashboard, but it is lacking definitely in comparison to what is there for AWS. And then they have low latency and execution. So basically, you're not waiting on anything to warm up. There's no cold starts. There's nothing like that for either of them. Okay, so different types of use cases. As you can see, there's a lot of similarities. We're going through them. Some use slightly different wording in the lists that they put together, but they're very similar. You can tell that it seems like one of them is reading the other one's documentation and going, yes, I'll have that one too, when they're doing them, because that's how close they are. So basically, for step functions, they talk about doing automating ETL jobs, orchestrating microservices architectures. They orchestrate large-scale parallel workloads, which is the one thing I think that they have over and above what GCP has from that perspective, because GCP has just recently, as I said, introduced parallel. And it's therefore some of the things that they have, which they have a very small limitation on the memory that variables can take up within like a workflow, which is like, it's quite small when you're trying to do fan out and trying to do various things like that. So hopefully that will increase over time. Also, AWS talks about creating ML pipelines. And then they also have that human in the loop. So basically what that means for anybody who's not aware is if you have a process that goes through various things, but you need a person to ultimately check something in the middle of the process to make sure maybe it's every 10,000 actions, you want a person to check that your like machine learning algorithm is still doing what they're being expected to do, something like that. So that's sort of where that human in the loop, so it goes out, a person might hit a button and go, yes, I approve all of these, and then it goes back into your step flow process. And you can see that that's why it needs things like, a year length of processing, because you're dependent on a person hitting a button. That person may have gone on holidays and different things going on. So, excuse me, that's why they work well from that perspective. And then, et cetera. There's lots of other use cases you could probably use it for. It's like whatever your imagination sort of can come up with. Google Workflows is similar. They talk about business process automation, in which AWS doesn't really call out. They also talk about data and ML pipelines. Again, because of that timing, because it can take a little bit longer, because you're not at the mercy of like a 5-minute window or whatever. And then also about app integration and microservices orchestration. Depending on how you architect your applications and your solutions, some people have it where they have serverless, but they have lots of like Lambda functions or things like that, but they're actually talking to each other. Some people use pub subs to do stuff like that. That works really well if they're all independent and it doesn't matter which one finishes before the other one. Or you're not trying to do batches. As soon as you bring batches into play, then you need something like a workflow or step functions to be able to actually coordinate where you get fan out in the middle, but it still waits for everything to finish before it gets back in again. Yeah, I think that's me. Okay. So the next one, cost of running. So I apologize for the amount of stuff that's on this slide. I tried to simplify it and it was just getting a bit mad. But okay, so this is how the cost of step functions gets calculated. So the top one is the standard one, which is the one that can run a year, is only once and tends to be if you were trying to do large batches or something like that. So it costs 2.5 cents, per 1,000 transactions. I'm going on the left-hand side here, this side over here. So WF is workflow. So if you have an example of a workflow that's doing 10 steps, each step has retries, and then the size and memory of that whole workflow is 50 meg. Okay, the 50 meg is not important for this calculation, but we do use it in the express workflow calculation, which is more complicated than these ones are. So basically, it's 2.5 cents per 1,000 transitions. Okay, and a transition is if I don't have a diagram. I should have a diagram. Of a workflow. But basically, if you think about it, it's lots of little transactions and steps joined together with lines of flow, of movement between them. When you make a decision, depending on that decision, it goes in a direction of flow. Okay? A transition is every one of those flows. So every step, every box you have on your workflow is considered to be a transition. So 10 steps equals 10 boxes, which equals 10 transitions. Every time it retries those, then that's another transition. So if you just max this out and say, if I'm having a particularly bad day and everything that's happening in my workflow is retrying for whatever reason, AWS are having a problem, something's happening, then if you multiply those all out together and then you say that you're doing 1 million transactions a day, need a point, and you've got one workflow and the whole thing takes 30 seconds from end to end, say. Okay, so the next line is where you've got your maths. So you've got 10 steps times 3 retries, which is 30 transitions, yeah, multiplied by 1 million transactions, which is 30 million. Divide that by 1,000, and you come back to 30,000, I think. And then you multiply that by 2.5p, and it works out as $750 per day, okay? So that's using your standard flow, okay? Some of the things to note is they're happening in 30 seconds, so you're well within your 5-minute limit for express workflows or express step functions. So that might be something you might want to consideration depending on the cost of it. Because $750 a day for 1 million transactions is very expensive, I think. But you could batch those up and do that as one batch of 1 million transactions all going through at the same time because you have that whole year to get through them, depending on what your business need is. So if you did that, that would end up being one transaction batch. So you just have your 10 steps times 3, which would be 30, multiplied by 1, which is like 30 multiplied by 2.5p, 2.5 cents. Sorry, so you're talking, what's that? 70, 85p, 85 cents, something like that, which is a big difference from the 750. Okay. So Google Workflows is quite simple as well in how they work it out. So they do it by steps. The only slight difference they have is they charge differently for internal steps versus external steps. Internal steps are things that are happening inside GCP. External steps are things where you're calling out to some like external services API to do something. Say you're calling out to Auth0 or something like that to do something, that would be considered to be an external step. So anywhere you can at all, or the other thing as well is if you've spun up your own domain inside GCP, even though it's inside GCP, because it's got a different domain, that would still be considered to be an external step. Okay. So anyway, I need to go faster. So basically what that is they've got internal steps. So I've just made the assumption that everything that we're doing is internal steps for this. So you've got 1 cent per 1,000 internal steps across all workflows. So they don't look at anything about the numbers of them. So if you take that and multiply it out, basically for the same scenario in the same situation, it works out as $300 per day. So it's basically less than half price of the same set of like workflow types in AWS. But only if you've got that kind of workload. If you go to the next one where AWS has express step function, I know you're not going to make decisions about which cloud you're working in and which workflow you go based on step functions alone, but it's just an interesting comparison. So if you look at this on step functions for Express, what they have done is they've got requests and duration. So they don't care how many workflows you have, or like how many steps you have within a workflow, anything like that. They talk about requests, which is a whole end-to-end workflow, and the length of time it's running. Okay? And then there's a bit of calculation in the middle, which is talking about how much memory it takes up. So they chunk it up cost-wise per 64 meg block, excuse me, off, they call it billable memory. But they charge per gigabyte. So basically, when you do that crazy calculation, which I'm not going to go into, the slides I think are getting sent out, so you can look at that yourself afterwards. But if you do that, work it out for exactly the same scenario, but using express steps functions, it comes down to $32 per day. So you can see why it's really important to make the right decision of which one you choose for the workload that you've got. The other caveat is if you do pick standard step functions at the beginning, you can't flip over to be express and vice versa. You have to, what you start with, you're stuck with unless you like blow it away and start again. So there you go. And then on the Google workflows, what I've just put in there is the link to their pricing, so you can actually get a bit more details. Okay, demo time. Problem is my demo is probably about 15 minutes long, and I've got 3 minutes left. So it is out there, so if you do get the slides when they go out, you'll get the demo, and I have done a voiceover, so I apologize in advance for the demo, but you can have a look and see what you think of it. What I've actually done is I've focused on GCP workflows because that's where I'm at the moment. And what I did was I was coming up with a plan of what I was going to do around something similar to the type of environment that we would normally work with and the type of triggers that we would work with. And I was looking through the Google documentation, and they have their labs are excellent, actually. I don't know if anybody's on Google or has looked at them before, but they have a ton of labs for all the different services and things they have. So they're all free. They're all just sitting there in their environment. So what I did was I picked one of their labs, which is actually more indicative of the type of operations that we're doing, and I just worked through the lab. I did find an issue with the lab, so the scripts, I had to amend the scripts and some of the permissions and things because that weren't covered, but all that's in there. If you're interested, you can go and look at it. So, all right, so there it is. It does exist, but I'm going to move swiftly along. If I click, will it go past that, or will it? Nope. No. There. Phew. All right, so we'll go to final thoughts instead. So final thoughts is basically when using step functions or Google workflows to only pass data in that you don't mind getting stored, because it stores everything. Thank you. It stores everything in their logs. So if you put in like private data in there, if you have people's names and addresses because you're doing something to do with like data cleansing of addresses or something like that, whatever, that data that you're passing through will get into their logs, and their logs are much more visible to anybody in your organization, unless you've got your security policy set up properly that they aren't. But basically the rule of thumb is don't pass the minimum amount of data that you need to between these. Use different types of patterns where you pass an ID across, and then they use the next sort of task uses the ID to go out and look up the data, process it internally within the task, and then write it back out again, so that you're not actually passing it between tasks. That's really important to do that, especially GDPR and everything else. Next one, visual representation of workflows is quite rudimentary within GCP, but within AWS, it's very, very full. You can do debugging in it. You can set up workflows in it. You can click on the different tasks. You can see things that have worked well, things that have failed, tasks that have got like paused or something like that. You can actually click on them and you can see the results. You can see the error messages. You can see what the inputs were, what the outputs were. You can see all that information. In GCP, when you look at it, all you've got is you've got the YAML, which is the definition of the workflow. and then you've got a diagram of the boxes that represent the workflow, and you can click on everything, but they're not representative of each other, and you can't dig into anything. So that's the one thing that if Google are listening, do a little bit more with that. That would be awesome. So next thing, debugging Google workflows is not yet possible using their visual editor, which is basically what I was just saying. And then the last one is Google workflows are just not quite as mature as their step functions, but they are adding new features all the time. So, and again, recently parallelism, which I've mentioned a couple of times. So there we are. And then that's me.